this tutorial. My name is Samantha Wiltshire, and today we'll be talking all about how to understand the paper that you're using for your art making. We'll be running through some lesson objectives, discussing the history of paper. We'll be learning about paper and its material properties. We'll be considering sort of what thoughts might go into selecting the right paper for your project. We'll be going through an overview of some main paper types you might come across. We'll be talking about experimental options for paper and concluding with some references and further activities. So the goals for today are to select paper to meet your personal goals and to suit your preferred materials. We want to understand the material properties of our paper. We want to become familiar with a variety of paper options. And hopefully we're going to build some confidence in purchasing art making materials. So before we delve too deeply into selecting the right paper, let's first understand what paper is and where it came from. So before paper, art and writing were recorded on papyrus. Papyrus is a material which is typically made from reeds, which are grown in Egypt, especially along the River Nile. And also along with papyrus, we had some other options too. We had stone and wooden tablets, parchment, which is made from animal skin, and even the natural and man-made monumental surfaces around us. So for example, rock surfaces, cave walls, structural walls, pillars on buildings. These were all great options for us to record our art and our history. Paper, as we might understand it, or at least more close to how we might understand it today, originated in China, and it was originally for the documentation of Buddhist text. And then these Buddhist scholars would transport their paper throughout Asia. And so as the paper spread throughout Central Asia, it was discovered that drier materials like linen could actually be used to create paper as well. So these Chinese Buddhists, they, when they were in China, used traditional plants to create their paper. And then when they traveled further throughout Central Asia, they no longer had access to these traditional plants. And that's why they needed to start experimenting with new options. Once it was discovered that linen, for example, could be used to create paper, Muslims were also introduced in Central Asia to paper as a new technology, and they then proceeded to spread that throughout the Islamic world, and from there it then traveled beyond. Eventually, paper would become a tool for sharing art and the creation of books and stories, rather than just for documentation, administration, correspondence, and also the spread of religious text. And so then in Europe, much later on, we eventually have the emergence of the printing press, and that of course transformed paper's usefulness for us. So paper's got a really long history stemming from China, but then being sort of transformed as it's continued its journey throughout the world. And paper continues to progress today. We've got lots of new technology in terms of the way that we treat and produce paper. And we'll be talking a little bit more about that in depth today. Before we get there though, let's first understand the material properties of paper. And these are some really important vocabulary words. You might like to take a screenshot of this screen and add some of these vocabulary words to the vocabulary list in the resource that was sent out to you after professional practice if you're in our diploma or advanced diploma program. So let's start with tooth. Tooth is, in simple terms, the texture of the paper, how smooth or rough it might be. When you look at paper, you'll see that it has oftentimes a bit of a texture, and that texture is what we would describe as the paper's tooth. We also really care when we're talking about paper about the base material. So most good quality paper is made from cotton fibers rather than cellulose. Cellulose is a wood pulp, which does tend to deteriorate a little bit faster. Paper is also treated with sizing, and that's a type of gelatin glue. Cheaper paper tends to have a little bit less sizing. We can also talk not only about the base material, but how it's manufactured, in particular, whether it was treated with a cold press, a hot press, or rough. Hot pressed paper is treated with heat. It dries faster and is a little bit less absorbent. Cold press paper was processed through a cold roller. It has a medium drying time if I was to be using wet materials on that paper, and also a medium level of absorption. And then we've got rough paper. Rough paper has been imprinted by a patterned roller, and it does have the slowest drying time when it's used with wet materials. The next factor for us to consider is light fastness. Light fastness is all about how much that paper fades upon exposure to light over time. So off-white paper tends to maintain its color best, although no paper is completely light fast. So certain colors, for example, red and blue, might tend to fade faster than other colors, and it's important that we're aware of that when we're making material choices. You can extend the life of the color of your paper by storing it away from light until you're ready to use it. We should also consider weave tightness, and we measure that in GSM, or grams per square meter. So GSM is how many grams of fiber per square meter have been compressed to form that paper. The higher the GSM, the more durable the paper. For wet mediums such as watercolor, you might wish to go, for example, for 300 GSM or higher. Now we also can talk about flexibility. So some paper with more sizing, remember that's that gelatin glue we talked about earlier, may be stiffer. Papers with a higher GSM are also likely to be less flexible. And also kind of related to flexibility and that weave tightness and GSM is weight. So we measure weight when we're talking about paper in ream, and that's a measurement of 500 sheets of paper and how much that weighs. So we can think about paper weight because weight will usually also speak to the durability of the paper, what that GSM is. These are all sort of factors which feed into one another. Another really important consideration for us as artists is water absorption or imperviousness. So absorption is, of course, the ability of paper to suck in fluid and maintain it within its structure. If something is impervious to water, it means that it does not allow the water to infiltrate the surface. We can also talk about this in terms of hydrophobic or hygroscopic paper. Hydrophobic meaning that it wants to repel the water or not take it within its surface, and hygroscopic meaning, of course, the opposite. So our sizing, that glue prevents water from destroying paper when wet. Water should sit on the surface of your page for a short time before it either evaporates or sinks or bleeds into the paper surface. If liquid materials are used on paper, which is either improperly treated or maybe that treatment has deteriorated or been damaged over time, what can happen is we can get uneven drying, pooling, we can get unwanted pigment feedback, which is another way of saying some funky paranormal activity with our color, maybe unexpected colors or pigments behaving in ways we weren't anticipating. We can get pilling of our paper, which is when you get those sort of little paper balls that will form on your page. It's the same as pilling that might occur on your clothes. Well, not the same, but similar. We can also get buckling, which is where a saturated page might form ripples. And these ripples can be really hard to get rid of without then stretching the paper somehow. And we can also then get tearing and fragility in general of that page. We can also think about size when we're making our choices. So different paper types vary in terms of their minimum and maximum available size. You need to consider the desired scale of your intended artwork and whether or not that might impact your choice of paper. We also need to think about the archival quality of our paper. Archival meaning that something will last a really long duration of time without drastically deteriorating. So this is one of the most important factors when you're thinking about the longevity of your work. The paper type which is most archival should be acid-free. So acid-free papers, they're the preferable choice. If something's acid-free, it means that it has a neutral pH. That's what we're aiming for when we're choosing a paper. And most paper on its actual branding will let you know whether it's acid-free or not. Or if you pop onto the manufacturer's website, usually they'll make it clear whether their paper is acid-free. And in terms of the longevity of our paper and also its usefulness for our particular medium, we can think about abrasion resistance. So that is, I guess, a measurement of how your paper maintains its structure when it's scratched, rubbed, or physically disrupted repetitively. And we want to think about abrasion resistance when we're considering whether we might be doing a lot of sgraffito, maybe some scratching back, when we might be doing a lot of really intense erasing on our surface, whether we're just using bristly or abrasive forms of application, maybe a scratchy brush to apply something to a paper surface. This could all be relevant factors for us to consider when selecting our paper. So a bit of a summary, now we understand paper's material quality. When you're selecting your paper, you want to understand which tooth or texture will behave best with your choice of intended material. We've got a great diagram over here by Strathmore showing how different materials sit on different textured paper surfaces. So we really want to be thoughtful of that. We need to consider whether the weight of your paper can support the layering you might plan on achieving. If you're using mixed media techniques or collage, or you're using wet and dry mediums, will your paper actually be able to support that? You need to consider, if you are also using wet materials, what the durability of your paper is and how it behaves when it's exposed to water. Is it going to buckle, deteriorate, or pill? You need to consider what sort of paper will fall within your budget, of course, and also what scale of paper you need and which type of paper you'll be able to access in that particular size. You might also want to consider the industry standard or expectation for your discipline or medium. So if you're a printmaking artist, there'll be particular expectations about which sorts of paper are appropriate for printmaking techniques. If you're a watercolor artist, it wouldn't be professional to use a paper which will behave poorly when it's exposed to water and to be selling works to clients which are buckled and damaged. So that's very important. We also might want to think about the flexibility of our paper. If we were origami artists, we would need to be able to bend and fold that paper. Or if we're people who sculpt with paper, or people who like to do collage or mixed media that might involve folding, that would be really important for us. And then also similar thing, if you're doing collage art or maybe more contemporary processes which involve paper, then you might want to think about how that paper tears. So will it tear? And if it tears, how easily will it tear? And what will that raw torn edge look like? Will that give you the aesthetic outcome you're hoping to achieve? We can also think about paper in terms of there being two main types. And Strathmore has a really great little diagram that outlines the difference between the two. So we've got sketching paper and drawing paper. A sketch paper is usually preferable for rough designs, thumbnailing, or experimental pieces. And drawing paper is best for finalizing high quality pieces. So particularly in cases where we might have some really complex or sophisticated rendering techniques going on, we want to make sure we're choosing a paper which will support what we're doing. So here we can see a direct comparison. Sketch paper, we can see has a lighter weight, whereas that drawing paper is heavier. We can see that sketch paper is best for dry media, whereas drawing paper is sort of good with all dry media because it oftentimes has better thickness. You might be able to get away with some wetter media as well, just depending on the brand and the type of your drawing paper. Sketch paper tends to have a lighter tooth, whereas drawing paper will have a bit more of a texture. It will have a medium tooth surface. And then sketch paper, of course, is a little bit less expensive, whereas for drawing paper, you're hoping to go for a higher quality, and you will end up paying most of the time a little bit more for that. So let's talk about some of the paper options which are available to you. Now, keep in mind that we're going to be going through a list today, but the paper options available are really, really extensive. So this is a very brief summary today. The first one we'll be talking about is cartridge and newsprint paper. So newsprint is made from wood pulp, Some newsprint is now produced acid-free, although usually newsprint is not. And those that are produced acid-free are actually nowadays marketed directly for artists' use. So you can go and actually buy yourself a pad of artists' newsprint paper, as opposed to just a stack of newsprint or a roll of newsprint paper. We've also got cartridge paper. Now, cartridge paper is made from wood-free cellulose, and it is best used with dry materials, so for drawing techniques rather than painting techniques. And so the history of newsprint is that it was traditionally used for mass producing printed publications like newspaper, and cartridge paper historically has been used for the operation of old-fashioned firearms. Both these types of papers are really effective for quick drawing and sketching, drafts, experimentations. Newsprint in particular is often used for beginners who are practicing very short life drawing poses until they gain a bit of confidence. So cartridge paper tends to be the better of the two. It tends to be more suited for producing nice drawings, whereas newsprint is more of like a rehearsal surface. The benefits of both of these paper types is that comparatively, they're usually quite a bit cheaper than other types of paper, and they're also really easily accessible. You'll be able to buy them at most art suppliers. And the limitations are that these paper types are not as thick and durable as other paper types. They do not behave well with wet materials. And in the case of newsprint in particular, it's not always acid-free. We can also think about tracing, transfer, and baking paper. So these types of papers are semi-transparent, allowing for the tracing of an image. In the case of transfer paper, it will also have a coating, which when pressure is applied will create a copy of your image on another surface of your choice. This paper is used for getting the outline or impression of an image for any artistic purpose, really. And transfer paper allows you to not only copy, but actually directly create a replication of that image. And oftentimes that's done on a surface like lino, wood, canvas, or fabric, because we might be trying to take a drawing and translate that so that we can create a lino cut print, a carving, a piece of embroidery on top of a fabric surface. Those are the sorts of options that are open to us when we understand this paper. So of course, the benefit is that it creates really close to exact copies of complex images in short periods of time with precision. And the limitation is that baking and tracing papers are not themselves ideal as the base for finalized drawings. Now let's talk about watercolor paper. So what's interesting is that any paper can actually be a watercolor paper, just depending on its material characteristics. So we do see a lot of paper which is marketed specifically as watercolor paper, but you don't need to be limited just to those. There's lots of surfaces which will take watercolor. So really, it's just a surface which has the required durability and behaves well when wet. Those are the surfaces you're looking for watercolor paint. And it's, of course, used for the application of watercolor, but also gouache and other associated mediums. This includes deliberate, sometimes heavy application of water to cause pigments to spread and bleed. So with that in mind, we really want to think about absorption versus imperviousness when we're choosing a good paper. And of course, durability. Is this paper going to deteriorate when wet? So the benefits of this paper are not only durability and behaves well with water, but most watercolor papers will be really high quality and versatile. So you could actually use a great variety of mediums beyond just watercolor paint itself on a watercolor paper surface. That could be both wet and a variety of different dry materials too. And its limitations are that it's not as easy to flex, fold, and tear as other paper types. Let's now have a chat about card and cardboard. Card and cardboard are slightly more out-of-the-box surfaces that you could work on. And cardboard basically is just a category used to describe thick paper-based board or sheet, which is typically used for industrial purposes. Card is a little bit different. Card paper is usually deliberately marketed for either art or craft or to companies that are wanting to use it for printing or publishing. It does tend to be thick like cardboard, and it comes in a whole variety of colors, oftentimes really bright colors. And it also comes in more choices in terms of texture. So with cardboard, you'll often get this grooving where pigment will pool inside of it and create this lined effect, dragging down the surface. Card, you can find surfaces which have more texture, but you can also get very smooth card if you weren't looking for any texture at all. So these can be used as alternative drawing, painting, or mixed media surfaces for artists, especially if we give them a really good prime with some gesso first before we start working on them. And some of the benefits are that depending on the type of card or cardboard, it could create really interesting and unique textures and outcomes. Often, this is really easily accessible material, especially if you're using found or recycled cardboard. Maybe you've moved house, you've got some leftover cardboard boxes. How could we maybe use those for our practice? And in the case of cardboard, it's often already a nice toned surface as well. So you can see here that Eichenberger has used not only a paint, which is this beautiful orange color, but he's also used white on this surface. And then the toned surface of the cardboard helps to create the mid-tones. And the limitation is really usually that cardboard is not acid-free, all right? So do be careful. If you're buying card, which is for specific artistic purposes, that card paper may well be acid-free. Cardboard that you'll be finding off the street is very likely not acid-free. All right, and now Bristol paper, let's talk about that. So Bristol paper is a durable and acid-free paper type consisting of multiple material layers bound together with glue under high pressure. It's used both by artists working in a variety of different mediums and for commercial purposes, particularly printing and advertising. It's sturdy, thick, it's durable. It requires less attention in terms of mounting because it's already quite thick. It's not going to be bending and flopping around. It will already have more of a professional appearance. And it does come in a range of types suited to different materials as well. And some of its limitations are that it's not ideal for cutting, tearing, folding, or bending because it is a very sturdy surface. And here we have a diagram of the layers that have been put into this Bristol paper. I did have a student ask me whether felt means that it's actually felt, you could use the felt material for a felting project and create a little animal or something out of it. It's not quite the same thing. When we're talking about felt in this context, we're talking about the type of paper that is that initial top surface layer. All right, let's talk about toned paper. Toned paper is a really broad category that we would use to describe any paper which comes in a mid-tone rather than just in white. This ranges beyond just grey and can also include a whole variety of usually muted or neutral colours. When we use toned paper, we're generally using it as a surface for a variety of materials where we may wish to use white as well as black or a dark colour, or a whole variety of colours. And this allows the value of the paper to support the illusion of 3 dimensions and to contribute to creating a full tonal scale. So we can see a great example here in this portrait by Christina Ora, who's a tutor here at Sydney Art School. The grey of the page becomes her mid-tone, or at least one of her midtones, and she creates the rest of her midtones and her black using this dark material, which may have been pastel or charcoal. And then we've got a white material, which has been used to bring out those highlights where the white of the paper is not able to be those highlights. Some of the benefits of toned paper include the fact that it does come available in a variety of textures, thicknesses, and finishes, which are suitable for quite a variety of different materials. The base value of the paper will, as we've just discussed, also help with creating more realistic rendering. And the limitation is that white or light materials are usually required for highlights because that raw paper will not in and of itself provide those values to us already. All right, let's talk about pastel and charcoal paper next. So we've just talked about toned paper, which is a nice segue into charcoal and pastel paper, because this is a paper type which usually does come in not just white, but a whole variety of different tones, as you'll be able to see in the diagram by Jackson's Art Supplies on the right. So papers marketed as being specifically for pastel or charcoal usually have a medium to coarse texture, come in a variety of tones or white, and are usually quite sturdy. Any paper can be used as a pastel or charcoal paper if the texture of the surface celebrates the material qualities of that charcoal or pastel. So if I have an oil pastel, I want to think about what texture of paper would best celebrate the quality of that material. If I had a chalk pastel or a Conti stick instead, that's going to be far more powdery, and that might suit a different sort of surface. And so this paper is usually used for art making purely. It doesn't tend to have a commercial use, at least in examples where it is marketed as being specifically for charcoal and pastel use. We know, of course, that we could use a whole different variety of combinations of mixed media on these surfaces as well. Some of the benefits are that it's usually a durable paper type, although that does depend on the brand and what specifically you've purchased. And there is quite a nice variety of choice available. And the main limitation here is that not all of these will behave well when wet. So just something to be aware of if you were thinking of doing a mixed media piece. So let's discuss now oil sketch paper and canvas pads. So these are sketchbook-like pads of either primed unstretched canvas or specifically prepared paper suited for the application of paint and related mediums. And oftentimes you'll find pads of these located very close by to where other sorts of sketchbooks and pads of paper will be in the art shop. Oil sketch paper is normally textured to mimic the quality of canvas, and it will almost always be primed or treated or sealed in some way to make sure that that surface is appropriate for that sort of wet medium. So this acts as an alternative and more portable surface for paint. Artists often will use these for smaller studies and experimentations, and they can also often be used for acrylic paint or pastel. A variety of other mediums as well might be suited to this surface. So the main limitation of oil sketch pad and canvas pad is that the quality and treatment or priming is going to vary. So depending on what you pay, depending on which brand you select, you may get a less or more thoroughly primed surface. So you will probably notice this straight away when you start adding your oil paint to the surface. If that surface is just drinking it up and not allowing you to blend with the usual amount of ease, that could be an indication that it's not well primed. This can be resolved a lot of the time by adding an underlayer of gesso before you paint with oils on top of this surface. It is also good to be aware that these materials are not ideal for tearing or folding. You will also see acrylic paper on the market. So this is a very thick paper, also usually mimicking canvas texture like our oil sketch pads, that has been treated or primed. It is designed for the application of thick acrylic paint or acrylic washes, as well as other types of wet mediums. So this acts as an alternative to stretch canvas. Artists can use these for smaller studies and experimentations. And you could also use these for pastel and other types of mediums and mixed media. The benefit of this material is that, again, it can be used for any medium, really. It is designed not to buckle, pill, or disintegrate when wet, and it may be a more portable choice for some artists' practice than taking canvas around with you. And the limitations are that despite being similar in nature to oil sketch paper, not all types are treated to best support oil paint as well as just acrylic. The quality and preparation of this paper before it reaches you may vary. So just like with the oil sketch paper, if you're finding that that surface seems to be not well primed, adding that additional underlayer of gesso again will assist you with quality, and it's also not ideal for tearing or folding. Okay, let's talk about different types of paper which suit printmaking. So whether marketed as being for printmaking or not, these papers really need to be durable, acid-free, and treated in a way which allows for appropriate ink absorption. It is also preferable that they can tolerate being moistened as well, especially for intaglio etching processes. So printmaking papers are designed for the finalized transferred impressions of relief or intaglio prints. These prints are usually applied to paper surfaces using pressure from a press or a baron. So baron is like a little handheld pad that you can sort of rub on the back of the work to transfer that image. You'll be able to find them at art shops that are made from bamboo. But I've also seen ones sold online which are made of glass and other materials as well. Now, the benefits of these paper types are that they're usually durable and suited for a variety of materials, again, beyond just printmaking. That's when we're talking about papers which are marketed specifically as being printmaking papers, like these options in the image by Art Supplies Australia. And the limitation is that the quality and ability to withstand water saturation can vary. So depending on what type of paper you've selected from what brand, you will find that they'll have slightly different outcomes, and it might take a little bit of trial and error to decide which would be best for your practice for the long term. You will also see paper marketed as being specifically for mixed media. We know, though, that any paper can be a mixed media paper. Those marketed for mixed media, though, are usually durable. They're usually thick because they need to support the weight of fairly intense layering. They're usually quite abrasion resistant, and they're similar in nature oftentimes to a really thick watercolor paper. And they can come in a variety of different tooths and textures as well. So these surfaces are used for combining multiple different wet and or dry mediums, maybe also some collage processes in there as well. And the benefits are that these are really versatile paper types. They do normally behave quite well with wet materials and can support, again, that heavy layering without sort of being damaged over time. We can also, though, acknowledge that the limitation here is, again, tearing and folding, and these also will vary in their quality and price. So that's kind of the same, though, for all of these paper types. You will be able to find options for most of these, at a variety of different price points. For some types of paper, you're going to find that paying a little bit more is worthwhile. For others, you might be able to get away with quite cheaper, where the difference in quality is less noticeable. The best way to discover which brands are your favorite and work best for your budget is, again, just calculating what you can afford to spend, going through that extensive budgeting process, and then some trial and error and experimentation, visiting the art shop. I prefer going and buying paper in person myself better than purchasing online, because I can really clearly see and even feel sometimes the actual texture of that paper before I go ahead and purchase it. So I can make sure that it's what I'm looking for. Now, fairly contemporary paper type that you will see offered as well is Yupo paper. Yupo paper is a synthetic paper type derived from the processing of polypropylene pellets. So this is a highly slippery and water-resistant surface that is entirely unique. So this is usually used for the application of materials like alcohol inks and other liquid mediums, which will be able to stain the surface, and then the excess water will be able to evaporate away. These are also commercially used a lot of the time for marketing and packaging. And the benefits of this material is that it can be recycled. It creates unique outcomes that cannot be achieved on other paper surfaces, and it is impervious to water and quite durable. The limitations are that this is not an appropriate material really for folding and tearing, and there is a more limited range of materials that will work well on this surface. And the last paper type we'll be discussing today is rice paper. Rice paper originated in Asia and gets its name from its semi-translucency, which is similar to a grain of rice. And it can be made from a variety of fibers, including, for example, mulberry bark. And there are multiple varieties available. So you can get different textures, you can get different levels of durability as well. So rice paper is often used for traditional ink painting, including calligraphic writing as well. It comes in a variety of types, which we already talked about, that have different levels of durability and absorption. And some of these types are suitable for printmaking, bookmaking, and other art and craft practices as well. The benefits of a typical rice paper is that they allow for materials such as ink to spread depending on how much water you've gone ahead and added. And these oftentimes create unique artistic outcomes. They are also really good a lot of the time for tearing. So you will find that contemporary artists in particular really enjoy folding, tearing, scrunching, even sometimes sculpting with rice paper. Unfortunately, even though the tearability can be a great advantage for many people's practice, there is a limitation as well. And we do know that with rice paper, particularly when it's wet, it can be more prone to tearing accidentally. So we do need to be a little bit more cautious with it. It is also important to consider as a bit of a limitation that there is traditionally a right and a wrong side of rice paper. So usually the smooth side is the correct side. You will find that if you are painting on the incorrect side without realizing, you're going to be quite confused about why you're not getting perhaps your intended outcome. Being contemporary artists though, today, there's no rules. If you wanted to paint on the rough side on purpose to create some more unique outcomes, you of course would be welcome to do that. And speaking of contemporary experimentation, that segues us quite nicely into talking about some more out-of-the-box paper options you could be exploring. There's no reason that you couldn't go ahead and try working on some decorative or patterned paper. Maybe you're going to work on some old newspapers. You could try some oil pastel or something on some sandpaper. You could be using receipts or tickets, old tickets from things you've gone and seen or been a part of as surfaces for your art making, or as tools for collage like Ed Chapman does here in this example. You could be using wallpaper, old pages from books or old pieces of sheet music. You could be using found paper materials. Maybe it's, old invoices, or maybe you're using even toilet paper. There really aren't any boundaries about this anymore. And you could also be using recycled paper surfaces as well. So not only finding paper in your space, but you could actually be sourcing paper which is recycled as its manufacturing process, if that was something that you preferred. There really are endless options, and I would encourage you to thoroughly explore all of the possibilities. And I have some further activities that you could go ahead and do in your own time. You could practice using different types of paper with different types of art making materials to compare the results. I would recommend researching different suppliers to compare paper pricing and find the best price for high quality paper in your local area. So you can also select a paper supplier and investigate the environmental sustainability of that brand. Depending on the base material of your paper, what you're looking for in terms of that information might be slightly different. So if you're looking at a paper which is based off harvesting trees, what are their deforestation or tree growing practices? Are they ethical? If their paper is manufactured overseas, are their workers being paid fairly? Is there an environmental impact? Depending on your personal feelings and values and your practice, you may or may not want to investigate that further as well. And here I have the images and academic references for today's presentation. Feel free to pause the screen and take a better look if you'd like to follow up and do some more research of your own. And we're finishing up with a really beautiful paper sculpture of a hummingbird by Li Hongbo. And I think that's just a really great example of the fact that artists have just gone crazy with paper. Paper doesn't just have to be your surface. It can actually be the entire material you use for your whole practice. So definitely consider, using your paper in ways that you may not have in the past to grow as an artist. And our long-term goal is to confidently select paper to meet your personal objectives, form an opinion about which paper type works best for your personal practice, and to explore possibilities for experimentation. Thank you so much for your time, and as always, happy art making.